In this video lecture on Roger Caillois' terms for classifying games in play, we'll explore some of the words and ideas that we can use in this lesson and throughout the course for game design principles. So let's begin with Roger Caillois. Roger Caillois wrote a book, Man, Play, and Games, in 1958 in French, and it was translated into English. And it's been very influential for the ways in which people, in particular scholars of game studies, have been categorizing kinds of play, kinds of games, and ways of thinking about the relationship between structure and agency. Those aren't the words that Caillois uses, but those are the words that we would use now to think about some of his ideas. So he came up with two well, the whole book is really fascinating, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Your assignment for this lesson is to read one chapter of it, probably his most famous chapter, and it culminates with a rubric, as he calls it, that shows his way of classifying games by the kind of play and the category of activity. So let's take a look. This is an excerpt from the chapter. And here is where he says that he is proposing a division into four main rubrics, depending on whether in the games under consideration, the role of, and here are his four categories, whether competition, chance, simulation, or vertigo is dominant. And he calls these by other terms, by Greek words, agon, alia, mimicry, and elinx. And he says all four are part of play. One plays football, and these are the competitive ones, the competitive games based on competition, or where competition has the most dominant role. Roulette or a lottery, where chance is the most dominant, alia. Where mimicry is the most dominant, or simulation, where one is playing to be a pirate or Nero or Hamlet or Iron Man, right? Or one produces in oneself by a rapid whirling or falling movement a state of dizziness and disorder, which is vertigo, or as he calls it, elinx. So he's talking about, of course, in the 1950s, not video games, but he's talking about actual games that people play physically. Or kinds of fun, kinds of play. And so that's one of the things that we need to bridge when we think about using Caillois' terms for video games that are no longer physical, especially for that final category of elinx, and more on that later. This is his rubric that he includes at the end of his chapter. And you can see that we've got agon, alia, mimicry, and elinx across the top on that axis. And then we have these other two terms, paideia and ludus, going on the vertical axis. Well, let's take a look at what he has to say about that. So here's kind of a long chunk of his passage from the chapter that you read. But let's look at what I've highlighted to get at the core of the first time that he introduces his terms, paideia and ludus. Because there can be some misunderstanding, I think, about the ways in which Caillois intended for these terms to be used. First of all, the idea is that they are two opposite poles on a continuum. That means that they are either ends, and there are lots and lots of gradations in between. And one extreme is the idea of diversion, turbulence, free improvisation, and carefree gaiety. So that is just open and uncontrolled fantasy, and that is designated by the term paideia. Now, at the other extreme, this exuberance is contrasted with its inverse, right? Instead of anarchic play, there's this tendency to have tedious conventions, to have rules, to have it be based instead of on turbulence and free improvisation and that kind of play or fun. Now it is on something that is completely impractical, but uses a greater and greater amount of effort, patience, skill, or ingenuity. So it's the kind of play or the kind of fun that is increasingly complex and difficult. And that's what he calls ludus. So we can think about it as rule-based versus free and open, but it's actually something more than that as well, where it has to do with sort of like a carefree, exuberant, frolicking, impulsive kind of play versus something that is ever more skill-based, has to do with patience, more and more and more difficulty. And so it's that kind of a structure, not only rules. It's not just rules for rules' sake. It also has a level of difficulty versus something that is just anybody can do it. And so let's look again at this chart, right, at his rubric. And now we can see that each one of these categories of agon, alia, mimicry, and e-links, he has kind of ordered them, the kinds of games, the games that he's using as his examples, on this continuum from paideia to ludus. So, for example, when we look at the competition, the agon category, we see that the ones that are not regulated, like racing or those kinds of athletics, are on the paideia side, the impulsive, the idea of just running a race, a non-regulated race, as opposed to a contest or sports in general, which is more on the ludus end of that continuum. The same thing is true for alia, mimicry, and e-links. The more that they have to do with skill, patience, structure, we contrast on e-links, which has to do with that whirling and that kind of physical kind of play. Children just whirling around, or adults waltzing, as opposed to mountain climbing and tightrope walking. So I think that's a really good way of getting at the difference between the two. And then similarly, the idea of heads or tails for chance versus roulette in the middle of the continuum, and going towards the simple, complex, and continuing lotteries. There's another chart in mimicry as well, where children's games, playing with masks and disguises, are on that open, spontaneous end of the continuum, the spectrum. And then theater and spectacles in general, which are scripted and highly structured and focused in various ways, are and non-participatory for the audience, are on the ludus side. There's another chart that he makes, another rubric that Caillois includes, not in the chapter that you read, but again, if you're interested, you can read the rest of the book. It's really wonderful. And he's a sociologist, so he's really interested in a lot of aspects of games and play in society and how that impacts, how that particular aspect of what it means to be human and how people organize themselves in groups and interact with each other in these ways when they're doing these activities and around games and play. So he's interested in this in all kinds of ways. And so it's a very interesting book, beyond the idea of, oh, how can we use this for game design, which was not his intent or interest or anything he could have even really imagined. He was interested in something altogether different and fascinating. So one of the things that he does in this chart, which I think is really fantastic, is he looks at the relationship of agon and alia and mimicry and simulation in their cultural forms that are found in the margins of social order, right? So the ones that are kind of on the sides, not really in the very center. Then the ways in which they are integrated completely into social life. And he's thinking of French social life, mainstream French social life in the mid to late 1950s. So not what we have today, and maybe not something that we're familiar with, but maybe we can imagine that kind of European society in that time, in the 1950s. And so how, for example, for chance, for Aaliyah, that in the margins of the social order, we have lotteries and casinos. In the very center, integrated into social life in an institutional way, we have speculation on the stock market. And then he has this category of corruption, the corrupt version, which has to do with superstition and astrology. Right. And so he goes through these, and you can take a look at this chart here. I think it's very interesting. The E-Links one is also particularly interesting. On the margins of the social order are these kind of extreme sports, I guess, mountain climbing, skiing, tightrope walking, speed, riding your car, driving your car really fast or something like that. And then integrated into social life are professions requiring control of vertigo. So airplane pilots or something like that. And then the corrupt version would be alcoholism and drugs. So very interesting to think about how these kinds of games and kinds of fun, kinds of play categories are in these three categories that he has here, going horizontally: cultural forms found at the margins of the social order, the institutional forms that are integrated into mainstream social life at the time, and then corruption. We could think also, just something to think about what those would look like today. So Caillois was thinking about this two-dimensional rubric and thinking about games that are played in an actual world, mostly games that are played physically, and not a little bit about card games and maybe tabletop games, but not so much about that. I wanted to adapt this more to thinking about all the kinds of games that people can play, and so I wanted to add a third axis to this, to Caillois. So I added the axis of player agency. So agency is the ability to create real change, to have a real way of impacting one's environment or situation, or to make real choices that have a true impact in a game or any kind of other environment. So it's an important concept in psychology, for example, because oftentimes people have agency in their lives or in a situation, but they don't realize it. They don't realize that there are things they could do to change what's going on in their lives. And so it's important for them to understand the ways in which they can make change that would make things different for them, right? So when we think about it in games or in other things, we're talking about something a little bit different, but still it's that idea of what can you do that really does something significant that makes a genuine impact, or you have the perception of having made a genuine impact. With when we talk about other things about interactivity and interactive media, we'll talk about some of those, that idea of perceived interactivity, which is an idea I'm very interested in. Okay, so I built this model in a virtual world to try to get at some of the three-dimensional aspects of it and made it an interactive model. What you have here right now is a screenshot, but then here is some video I took of machinima, so animation captured in real time in a video game or another 3D environment. Here's the do this. So for an assignment, when you would be analyzing a game, in assignments for this course, you have two goals. First, to use the terms or concepts that we're exploring or learning about in that particular lesson to shed light on the game you are discussing. And second, to demonstrate your mastery of the material. So when you're analyzing a game, it is not a summary of that game. It's not a description of your experience playing that game, but a way in which you show that you understand the specific concepts that we're focusing on in that particular lesson as terms that you can use for analysis, for getting at the how and the why of understanding how something has been designed, how it creates a player experience. So let's really keep focused on that. So if, for example, you were going to use Caillois terms, you would want to make sure that in your analysis you demonstrate your mastery of those terms, that you understand what they are. You don't have to necessarily give a complete definition of them, but that wouldn't be a bad idea. You should say that they are from Roger Caillois' book, and say the source of wherever you're getting terms from, unless there's something that is original to yourself. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed learning more about Roger Caillois, and of course you have the whole chapter to draw on for more material, and if you're interested, definitely check out the rest of the book.